This is from the LA Times. This article is DNA from 4,500-year-old Ethiopian reveals surprise by ancestry of Africans. This reminds me of my original disagreement with Radio 1. He used to be one of the people, and I said, well, these ancient Egyptians are mixed black, and if you even look at the DNA tribes, they're mostly black in the Amarna pharaohs, and they're mixed with something else, okay? And so my argument was something along the lines of that they were mixed black and with the other peoples who live around, Indo-European, Semitic, so on and so forth. Now keep in mind, this article I'm about to show you, they're going to talk about how this people that may have been related to these farmers from Germany or something like that migrated all the way down to the Horn of Africa. Keep in mind, this is Djibouti, Ethiopia, the Gulf of Aden, the Horn of Africa, not North Africa. Okay? Now in the rest of this video, I'm going to show you how, one cannot then turn around and say, well, the Egyptians must have been white. I'm going to rule that out completely. And when all is said and done, you end up with mixed black, ancient Egyptians. The ancient Egyptians were no more non-black than Ethiopians are non-black. There are some people who don't consider Ethiopians black, but for the same reason I consider Ethiopians black is the same reason I consider the original Old Kingdom and the pre-dynastic pharaohs of Egypt black, and they were more mixed as time went along. It's always been my argument. Anyway, so they talk about the out of Africa theories and so on, and they thought that, about 3,000 years ago, 1000 BC or so, a group of farmers from Middle East and present-day Turkey came back to Africa. Okay, so it goes on to say that radiocarbon dating revealed that the bone was 4,500 years old. That meant Moda, as researchers called him, lived before Eurasians returned to the African continent, according to the theory. Okay, now Moda did not have any genetic variants for light-colored eyes or skin that evolved in the populations that left Africa. That's key. Nor did he have variants that arose in Eurasian farmers that allowed them to digest milk as adults. Moda did have 3 variants that are known to help modern Europeans live in high altitudes. When the researchers compared Moda's genome to those of contemporary humans, the closest match was the Ari people of southern Ethiopia. Makes sense, it was found in Ethiopia. But now listen to this part. With this information, the research team was able to investigate the mysterious group of Eurasians that came to Africa 3,000 years ago. They created a model that assumed that Ari genome was a mixture of DNA from Moda and had an unknown population from West Eurasia. Then they plugged in DNA from several candidate populations to see if they could get a combination that looked like Ari DNA. Okay, make a long story short, 2 results stood out from the rest. One was modern-day Sardinians, who are known to be the closest living relatives to the earliest farmers. The other were for members of the so-called LBK culture in Germany, early farmers who lived about 7,000 years ago. If the Eurasian settlers who arrived in Africa 3,000 years ago were indeed descendants of the LBK farmers, then the story of their migration through Africa needs to be revised, the researchers wrote. So by comparing, I may as well read this part too. I may as well finish it because it's right at the end, right? Yeah, I'll just finish it. By comparing the LBK genome with DNA from Africans alive today, the scientists calculated that these ancient farmers may have made up 25% or more of the population in the Horn of Africa during the migration years. All of those migrants ultimately pushed farther into Africa than previously thought, they determined. African populations from the western and southern tips of the continent got at least 5% of their DNA from these Eurasian migrants, according to the study. Some groups from Ethiopia, Somalia, Djibouti, and Eritrea can trace more than 30% of their DNA to these migrants. The ability to sequence ancient genomes has revolutionized our understanding of human evolution, wrote the research team, so on and so forth. Now, this is problematic for several reasons for a white Egypt. One is this is 4,500 years ago, which puts us 2500 BCE, not near the 3200 BCE date of the first dynasty of Egypt. Okay? That is a good 700 years off. and there's not a lot to support, this. Um, the next comes in with the actual characteristics. See, when you look up the hair, okay, black hair is common in every place in the world but Europe, pretty much. Okay? Now, if you don't believe me, let's just look it up real quick. We'll type in black hair. Okay, go down to black hair. Okay, distribution of black hair. Outside of Europe, the majority of humans have black hair. This is likely the original hair color of Homo sapiens and is found in its greatest distribution in Africa, Asia, and the pre-Columbian Americas. Okay, so this is African Asian sort of hair color. Okay. Now this brings me to the next clip. Well, if you consider me black, then you have to consider the ancient Egyptians black as well. You have Eurasian DNA making it even to the west and the south part of Africa. So if you consider people from Eritrea, Djibouti, and Ethiopia as black, then the ancient Egyptians surely were black as well. But they were also mixed. But what group of people would they identify with if they were around today? Certainly they would identify with black people. Okay? Now, right now you should have seen the stela of the races. Notice the European people and the Indo-European and the Semitic are very distinct from the Egyptian. They are also very distinct from the Nubians. The same way that an Ethiopian, a lighter-skinned Ethiopian, is very distinct from a dark-skinned person from West Africa, or say the Congo. Okay? Very distinct. Now, if I was to draw, quickly, and I wasn't too great of an artist, a person from Ethiopia, a person from West Africa, a person from the Middle East, and a person from Europe, or even a Berber, okay, it would pretty much look like the stela of the races. Now, the number one most problematic thing is you see, and hopefully, I've transitioned it well, you see there are several types of hair with the ancient Egyptians in their hieroglyphs. Now, this would indicate that there are several races at play here. So this is where it gets complicated. I believe what you're seeing here is that some people are perhaps closer relatives of the Semites, and some people are perhaps closer relatives of the black sub-Saharan Africans, if you will. Now this is rather problematic, okay? Because you can't then say that they are Semites, because Semites don't commonly have thick, curly hair. But Africans can have long, twisted, or braided, or dreadlocked hair. So when you look at, hopefully by now you see this on the screen, you'll see these long hairs that appears to be twisted. It's very interesting here. So when all is said and done, there's one or two things that must be the case here. One, they are all mixed African people. Two, you are looking at a population of Semites that stuck around after they migrated back to Africa, obviously through the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, and etc. And black people. So either they're all black people, and the straight hair you're seeing is black people straightening their hair. They're all mixed black people, or you're seeing a mix between black people and Semites who may have intermarried with the black people, a half caste, if you will, with a touch of Eurasian DNA from small groups of people having migrated through and perhaps leaving behind some inhabitants. But as you see with the Ethiopians and the Eritreans, the majority of their look is African. The majority of their DNA is black African. So, yes, in the sense of using our scale today, were the ancient Egyptians black? Yes. In the truest, most scientific sense, were they black? Yes and no. And of course, mixed in is groups from other places. You have in Egypt Semites, you have Indo-Europeans, you have even Europeans that found their way there, Mediterranean peoples, sea peoples. And you have, and in the Middle Kingdom, you see them have distinct parts of town. So, you know, people wanted me to address this hair issue because the most dramatic would be this. In hieroglyphs, you see a blonde hair. Okay? Egyptians were also known to take exotic wives, so this wouldn't be out of the ordinary at all. Now, if the blonde hair was a big enough issue to say that these people must have been white, it would be very prevalent in the hieroglyphics. Not to mention that this could be an artistic portrayal. Okay? It doesn't necessarily mean the person literally had blonde hair. But when you see Egyptians having black hair frequently, it means that they had black hair frequently. When you see the women portrayed as light, and sometimes the artist will portray the men as darker and the women as light. Fair enough. The problem here, which seems to prove the Afrocentrics point, is that women are often portrayed as dark-skinned as well, or at least my hue. So therefore, the ancient Egyptians were mixed black. And it makes absolute sense for me to identify with South Africans, who are some of the closest match to the Amarna pharaohs, also who are obviously relatives of West Africans and Egyptians. Because I'm not your typical Igbo. I'm not obviously a white person, not your typical African American, not your typical mulatto American, because my dad comes from Africa. He isn't, you know, I haven't been made mulatto from African Americans mixing with white Americans. So therefore, who would I identify with? Who has the most right to identify with the ancient Egyptians? It would be someone like me. Someone who is part Semite, part white, and mostly black. Another way to look at it, which is a curious way to look at it, is that I am mostly white because there's Eurasian DNA found its way to Africa. That's a very curious way to look at it. One that doesn't really seem to add up when you look at how I look. So if one was to look at it that way, then one must come to the conclusion that when it comes to gene expression, African features express themselves the most. And then it brings you back to where you started, not knowing what to think. Because what is race at all? Do all racial genes, if you will, do all ethnic genes express themselves equally? Who knows? It's an interesting thought, isn't it? But at the end of the day, they would identify with black people the most for the same reason that I do. Thank you.